Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam rasulillah. This is Principal Gabriel, the principal at Hamra Integrated School. And I just wanted to share with you a recent experience, an interesting experience as a foreigner, as a white, Caucasian, European, American, Muslim, first of all, Muslim before anything, of course, convert to Islam. Who converted to Islam 15 years ago, traveled the world, more than almost 40 countries now, alhamdulillah, Muslim world, non-Muslim world, and being very interested in culture and understanding the history of the people that I live with. And now living in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and trying to understand the culture and specifically the Islamic inheritance or the Islamic heritage of the Malay world. As a Muslim, that's something that's my prerogative as an academic and as a Muslim to have interest in this. And obviously doing some research, and recently I participated in the WISE summer program, which gave me a good understanding of the world Islamic view, specifically how it links to the Malay world, here being Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur specifically. And I did some research to try to understand, because I was quite fascinated by one of the lectures, which was called The Evidence of Jawi and Islamization in the Malay World. And I'm sure a lot of you might not know about that. And that's probably one of the most shocking things to me as an academician, as a researcher, as a cultural awareness trainer, when I realized that a lot of the Malay people and the Malaysians themselves, I mean, here the Malaysians, when we're talking about Malaysians, we're talking about the Chinese, the Indians, and so on, all the other nationalities who are either Malaysian or they're living in Malaysia. A lot of the people in the world at large, even the Muslim world, they're somehow ignorant of the heritage, the Islamic heritage, and specifically the Jawi and the Islamization of the Malay world. And of course, I did some research, and I attended an interesting lecture, and I read an interesting article by Elijah He, which was called Dispelling the Public Ignorance About Jawi, in which he makes a very interesting argument where he speaks about the fear that people have and how they confuse Jawi for Arabic, and hence they think that somehow Islam is being pushed down the throat of people, which he makes a case that it's not true. He himself is quite positive in the article and saying that is not true, that he himself is a Chinese, non-Muslim, but Malaysian, not Malay, but Malaysian, has been very fascinated by studying Jawi and how it helped him to grasp Bahasa Malay, the Malay language, and to understand it better and to speak it better. So it's quite interesting that people are mixing the two. It is an Arabic script, no doubt, and it does show it's an evidence of the Islamization of this part of the world, the language and so on. And this is a long talk. What kind of drew my attention was the fact that the people are opposing this are doing it from a perspective of fear. And putting that aside, this is just an emotion it's not necessarily condoned. But what I'm trying to say is that the Malay people, it is their prerogative and it is their right to be able to know their history. And sadly, because of colonization of this part of the world and many other parts of the world, if you look at the contradiction in the way literacy has been injected into the culture. So people, just for example, for the sake of argument, people have a problem with Jawi, okay, because it's Islamization and it's shoving down the throat Islam and so on. They don't have a problem with the Latinization of the language, because, I mean, come on, the Malaysian world, the Malay world, the Indian world, most of the world did not write using Latin letters. The so-called, let's speak a bit more freely, the English letters, that we talk about today, the English alphabet, as we call it, even though it's, they're just but they didn't use this, right? So colonization has moved and colonized most of the world. And yes, they have withdrawn themselves now to an extent from the interfering after, of course, taking the resources and whatnot. This is a different story. and it's not the purpose of our discussion right now. But they have basically revolutionized literacy, literacy, literacy. They've revolutionized it. They've changed the culture by injecting their script. And a lot of people might say, what's the big deal? It's just a script that codifies language, but it is a big deal because it comes with a certain cultural shift and it comes with certain control. And when the Jawi script was the de facto, the default in this part of the world, the language was strong and it was understood by the people because those who laid the foundation of the language and the Islamization of the language was for a reason. So why would we find a problem with this part, with Islamization, but we don't have a problem with colonization? This is my dilemma as a Westerner, as an academic, as a professional. It's my dilemma of the contradiction of this statement or of this issue. So this kind of drew my attention to do a bit more research about Islam in this part of the world and find that there's a lot of cloud, it's a lot of fog around how Islam came. And most of this fog is actually created by historians and writers who are not Muslim and who are, to an extent, pretty much they're civil servants of the colonizers. And I'm not talking here about conspiracy theories. We're talking here about from an academic perspective. People need to understand and to separate academia from personal emotions. And in academia, you try to speak objectively. You try to look at the evidences and you try to pose some questions in trying to understand what is going on. In emotions, you're going to talk about, we and they and we did this and it's going to lead to a big argument. It's not going to, go anywhere. But people need to understand when someone speaks in academia, you need to consider the evidence and accept if this is the truth. So first point that I made is the so-called contradiction, the double standards, and people not having a problem with the Latinization, modernization, westernization of not only the language, the literacy, the culture, everything. But they have a problem with the Islamization, which came way, way before. You're talking here about, 10th century, 11th century, long time ago, maybe even earlier. And that's why the fog is so big, because people have tried to cover things so that they make people feel, well, Islam is not that big part of this country. It's not a big part of this culture. Islamization sounds really bad, we're living in a 21st century. It's a mixed society, which is fine, and that is the truth. But that doesn't mean that you can strip apart the rights of the Malay people or anyone else like myself who's interested in understanding the truth and the history from them. To really go into it, to really go in depth, and to really from a historical point of view, from a truth point of view, to understand what has happened. Because, see, the people of this land, before the Chinese came, before the Indians came to live here and become Malaysians, and before the Westerners like myself came, and others, before the colonizers came, the Malay people accepted Islam. And it was not through a war, it was not through colonization, it was not through force. They themselves realized the superiority of this faith, the ethics, the morals. They're impressed. They're impressed. There is no such thing as colonization. So they themselves accepted it, be it at the government level and whatever form it was under the time. The people themselves, it was not like what others show in history in other parts of the world. Right? So this has to be considered because the Malay people conscientiously and consciously and willingly accepted Islam. So that has to be understood and appreciated. And no one has the right to take that away from them. And it should be a national endeavor, as it is in many other countries. Anyone who goes to France, they understand and study French history. And they have to study the French language. Anyone who goes to America, it is a must to understand the American history and the culture and so on. anyone who goes to Germany, anyone who goes to any other country, they have to understand and they have to stick to it. If anyone goes to China, will people accept the fact that you don't know anything to do with China? No, you have to acknowledge and accept the culture. And people talk, and there'll be rallies and museums, and the government will put in the school part of the curriculum for people to understand. And a lot of people willingly want to understand the culture and the rich heritage of the Chinese, the dynasties and so on, the kings. It's something that people find amazing. Why is it when it comes to Islam? I understand with what's going on in the media, people might have objections to other parts of the world. But in this part of the world, where we find that nothing happened of a military action in that case, in the greater sense when it comes to the Islamization of this region, why would people have this apprehension to study and to understand the rich heritage and history of the Malay world? And what's the let's say, the insecurity or the not being comfortable about the whole Arabic script, Islam, and so on? And this goes to show almost like I would say, a misconception of the people of this part of the world and others, specifically, as I said, even the colonizing powers, their scholars, the Orientalists specifically, who have written extensively about this part of the world, about Islamization, what happened. And a lot of times it was academically dishonest. And we have to have this discussion. We have to come out clean and dispel this public ignorance. And the only way it can be done is through academic lectures. The only way it can be done is through teaching, through going into the curriculum. And not as in like we're rubbing it on you, but it is part of your heritage. You live in this land. You live in this country. I do not understand in my so many years as a professional, as an academician, that you go to a country and the people who are living there are refusing, or they're ashamed, or they're uncomfortable to study the history. I'm talking about academics. Who can force someone to be Islamicized? Who can force someone? People are scared of like conversions or all these things, these religious sensitivities, taboos. But who is saying that? You're talking about education. And education is a weapon against ignorance. And ignorance is one of the biggest ills that causes actually, to an extent, violence. So if you want to dispel anything like that, let the people understand, let the people study, let the people understand the culture of this land. That is my first point. And Jawi is one of the, or if not the most important way in Islam itself to understand the history of the Malay world and how Islam has come here, because it has shaped this region. People have to understand all the blessings that they're experiencing in this part of the world. It has something to do, a lot actually to do, with what happened in history, the Islamization of this world, the ethics, the morals, the systems in this country are influenced to an extent by Islamization of this world. And as I said, Jawi is a medium for people to understand the language, to understand the older documents and scriptures that bear witness to the rich history in this part of the world. So one of the debates, or one of the documents, one of the evidences for the Islamization, the evidence of Jawi and the Islamization of the Malay world, is what we call the Batu Bersurat Terengganu, okay, which is basically the stone that had these 10 laws, pretty much basic Sharia laws, that were written in the Jawi script, and they date to 1303 or 702 Hijri, which is a long time ago. Now, this doesn't mean, we have to be careful here, that Islam started there. No, this is an evidence that Islam was already existing there, okay? And Islam was flourishing there, and it was accepted, and it became the state religion, and it became the religion of the traders and the business people and the people at large, and people accepted it willingly. But the interesting thing here The stone was found in 1887 in the Tersat River, and an Orientalist by the name of C.O. Blagden, he dated it between February-March 1303 to February 1387. Now, the date itself, the mistake in dating it can indicate a few things. Number one, ignorance, and this shows us that the people have it's their prerogative to be able to not push, but to expose, to show, to teach the world their history. And when people try to push dates a bit later, they're basically trying to delay and say, well, it took time or it was later. Islam is not that early. The Jawi script is not that early. I know it's a matter of 84 years or something, but it does make a big difference. And Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas, he went to an extensive explanation how he dated it back to Friday the 4th of Rajab 702 Hijri, or Friday 22nd of February 1303. I was blessed to be able to listen to the evidences in the lecture about this, and I actually encourage you. I'm not going to give you all those evidences here, but I encourage you to research. That's probably my objective of this video, is to encourage you, your children, even your government, to really take this seriously from a angle of culture, understanding, truth, and yes, it is, in the end, you cannot divorce Islam from this part of the world. It is the heritage. And not having a double standard of, fearing it. And why fear what? We are academically trying to understand what is the heritage of this land. As the Romans, as the Persians, as everyone else throughout the history, no matter what has happened in history. Because when we look into the history, Alexander the Great, for example, does he have a flawless record? No, but he's considered one of the heroes. Does Napoleon have a flawless record? We could not even compare it to what has happened, for example, just for the sake of argument, here in the Malay world. Yet we don't have a problem here in Malaysia to study these so-called two great heroes. When it comes to Jawi, Malay, Prophet Muhammad, people get nervous. And I believe that this is academically dishonest. It is ignorant that has to be dispelled, and it has to be done academically. It has to be done at the government level. It has to be done at a level where people understand that this is the heritage and people need to know it. It is a duty upon us. It is a scientific, it is an academic endeavor to be able to be more cultured and understand each other better. So the stone is an amazing piece of document. It writes, as I said, about 10 basic Sharia laws. It's a beautiful, the way it's translated. It talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It talks about God and the rules of God. It talks about marriage. It talks about behavior and ethics, and even it talks about laws and punishment. So this stone can be found in the National Museum, and I encourage people to read and hear about it, to understand, to look at Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas's lecture on how he dated the stone and why is it important. Because a lot of people might be like, I don't see the big deal. It is a big deal, and people need to understand that. So the more we educate ourselves about this, the more we'll be able to dispel the ignorance, the more we'll be able to understand, the rich history of this part of the world, the Islamization of the Malay world, and how it has shaped actually the blessings that we are experiencing here today, that you are experiencing here today, living in this country, and benefiting from this. So it is a duty, a ethical duty, an academic duty upon all of us to do this. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khair, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.